Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm here today to talk a little bit about CSS. I don't know how many, I get the feeling there's quite a lot of kind of server-side guys here. Can I just get a quick show of hands? Would you consider yourself as working almost exclusively on the server side? Quite a few. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate you giving up your Minecraft time to be here. So for the rest of you, hands up if you're front end. Anyone here consider themselves a designer? A few. Okay, nice little mix. My name is Peter Gasston. I tweet at StopsItGreen, and I write at brokenlinks.com. And this is my first time in Sweden, so I'm really excited to be here. I really like the fact that generally when I go somewhere new and I don't know the crowd, I start off my talk by kind of making a few like flattering jokes to tell people how great they are to get them to like me. But I'm really happy to be here because I know the Swedes are kind of far too clever and sophisticated to fall for that kind of stuff. My job title is Creative Technologist and Front-End Lead. It's one of those job titles that doesn't really mean much and doesn't really describe what I do. But essentially my job is to learn about cool new web platform stuff and evaluate it and think what we can do with it. I work for a digital agency called Rehab Studio. So we get clients come to us with offers and we say to them, oh, we think you could do it better using this technology, or this is how we would do your idea. So I kind of am across broad ranges of web platform technologies, but my favorite by far is CSS. And CSS, that's because CSS is cool. I really love CSS. I've written kind of about new stuff about it for years, and it's really exciting time to be involved in kind of doing CSS because there's so much cool stuff happening, so many brand new things coming down the pipeline. And so I'm here today to talk about some of the things which have kind of fairly recent and quite well implemented and you can use today, many of which you might know already. I'm here to talk about some of the cool new potential and probable stuff that's coming down the pipeline in the next year or so. And I'm here to talk a little bit about your role in CSS and developing CSS. One of the main questions I get when I do these talks about future stuff, the first question when I do the Q&As at the end is, well, when can we use them? It's all well and good you talking about this stuff, but when can we use it? I'm just going to ask you to kind of park that until the end of the talk, and I will address it, but just kind of soak up all the cool stuff and kind of leave the doubts about implementation until the end. Start off by talking about stuff that's new, and like I said, some of you will know this stuff already. Some of it's been in browsers for maybe 1 or 2 years, but I work with a team of 30 or so developers, and this is stuff that I don't see them use very often. So I think it's kind of quite new, but it hasn't quite got into the general kind of knowledge pool of stuff that's happened that you can do. And I'm going to talk about everything, not just the flashy stuff, but also the kind of the nuts and bolts, selectors and pseudo classes. I get kind of equally as excited about those, coming up with a novel use for a pseudo class, as I do for kind of building a bespoke grid system. First of all, a couple of units. Units are sexy. This is a browser viewport. And at the moment, when we want to size stuff in the browser, we tend to use pixels, percentages, EMs. But recently, and this is fairly well implemented now, we can use these new width and height units. The first is called the VW unit, the viewport width. The width of the viewport is 100 VW. Equally, there's the viewport height. And the viewport height is 100 VH. That's not the whole page, it's just what's available in the viewport. So you can size things by doing things like, I could use height 50 VH and width 80 VW and size a box that size. Now you might think, well, what's the advantage over percentages? Because in that example, percentages would do exactly the same thing. But percentages actually are affected by if the page has margin or padding. Percentages the available space to it, and it's also it gets VH and VW. They're not relative units. They're kind of absolute units. They're always, beg your pardon, they're always relative to the viewport, not to the element that contains them. So they have a big advantage over percentages in that way. You could use exactly the same units to measure in your mobile browser, and you would obviously get a slightly different box shape, but it would still be relative, exactly relative to the viewport. So they're pretty cool. Calculations, also very cool. Not a sentence you hear very often, but you can do calculations. Wherever you can put a unit in CSS, you can put a calculation in there. So instead of saying 10 EMs, you could do 9 EM plus 1 EM. There would be no point to doing that at all, but you could do it. But it's really useful, like in this case here, where you want something to be, say, 100% wide, but also to subtract, say, marginal padding from something. So it would still be perfectly spaced. And you can put any amount of units you like in here. You can also nest calculations within calculations if you want to go that deep. Again, I can't see any advantage in you doing so, but it's there, and you can use it. Selectors. I really like selectors. But one of the things about CSS at the moment is there's a lot of repetition, an awful lot of repetition in CSS. I'm sure you must have seen something like this before, where you want to take all links to be blue, except the ones inside ordered lists, and they can be red, except the ones inside the ordered list with a class of foo, and you want them to be blue again. So you get this ton of repetition here. So new CSS deals with this using the not function. So we could say in this case, any OL which does not have the class of foo, and which has a list item, just color it red, which is the exact same effect we want here, but with one less line of code. And this is really well supported, again, this stuff, the not selector. Once you start using it in your code, you realize how really, really vital it is, and you'll wonder what you've been doing without it for so long. Similarly, more repetition here. You could quite often say have a span inside an OL, span inside a UL, and a span inside a P, and we want to style them all the same way. You could give them all a class. That's true. You could just give them a consistent class. But if you don't want to go down that route, or if you kind of don't have access to the markup for some reason, you can use the matches function. So in this one, we're saying any element which is either an ordered list, an unordered list, or a paragraph, which is followed by a span, apply these styles. So all of these new functions are all about just getting rid of some of the repetition that we see in CSS. And it's really, really common. And that's why we have things now like SAS and less. And they're aimed at helping us get rid of some of that repetition. Everybody knows DRY, do not repeat yourself. But we want that stuff in native CSS as well. We don't want to leave that to the tools. We want it in the language. These are... you know you can use 4 values for background position now? Before you could just use 2 values. It was always calculated from the left and from the top. But now you can set from where the background position is calculated. You can say instead of being 80% from the left, you can say make it 20% from the right. So 4 values, and that just opens up lots and lots of new opportunities for positioning your stuff. Likewise, you can put background size into the background shorthand, which again, I think a lot of the developers I see haven't really realized that you can do yet. So you can have your position values followed by a slash, followed by 2 more values, which is your background sizing. Right, I can see you're not as enthralled by selectors and pseudo classes as me. So I'll move you on to something a little bit more sexy. Sticky. Sticky is sexy. So position sticky, you've probably used, in fact, many times throughout your career, something which emulates this. So probably use position fixed applied with JavaScript to make something always sticky. So when you scroll down the page, the thing stays where it is and the rest of the page scrolls, but only starts at a certain point. So all the stuff we used to do with CSS plus JavaScript is being brought natively into the language. I'll show you a quick example of what that does. We can set, in this case, the top bar to be sticky. And as you scroll the page down, it just gets to a certain point and stops and sticks there. And it works really nicely, works much better than position fixed on mobile as well. And that's quite well implemented, again, so far. But the best of all, the best new technology, there's a magazine called .NET, which is nothing to do with the language .NET. We have the magazine .NET in England, and last year they did their awards, and this won the most exciting technology of the year, which I found really, really weird, because it's not often that a bunch of CSS properties get voted the most exciting technology of the year. Flexbox, you may have heard the name. Anybody heard the name Flexbox? Anybody used it yet? Few hands. Now, Flexbox is genuinely really, really exciting because it opens up lots of new ways to lay out your pages that we couldn't easily do before. We could do them, but not with any great degree of ease. Essentially, it works like this. You set a container and you tell it to be flexible. You just set the display value to be flexible. And in my example, I'm going to have 3 child elements inside it, and each one's got a width of 30%. When you tell something to be flexible like this, it lays out all the child elements horizontally immediately. It ignores the general flow, the downward flow of the page. It sets these things to be 30%, and it doesn't float them, it just lays them out horizontally. So in this example, I've got 3 which have got a width of 30%, and so I end up with this kind of gap inside my parent container. What I want to do is fill that gap, but I don't want to have to keep recalculating. Say if I've got margin and padding in these boxes, I don't want to have to be recalculating the size to be sort of 33.257% or whatever it is. So what I can do is instead tell each child to have a flex value of 1. And that will just fill the parent. It will just distribute all that empty space, and it will increase the width of each box. So that 30% becomes like a starting point. So it says make these at least 30% wide, and then any leftover space, add it to each of them individually, equally, so that they fill the parent. And what's really exciting about this, again, is that 1 is kind of a ratio value. So all this unused space is being distributed between the children 1 to 1 to 1. So if we change that value, say we have 2 children, and we set one of them to have a flex value of 2, when they're resized, that unused space will be distributed 2 pixels to box A for every 1 pixel to box B. So they'll start to fill their container proportionately, but still fill it. And this is exceptionally useful when you're building UI. When you're building stuff with icons, boxes, form controls, to use these properties on them, they just naturally fill the whole space. And then if you change, if you change your layout using media queries, that proportion will still stay the same, or you can set a different proportion. So it just opens up a few new ways to start looking at laying out pages. But it does way, way more than that. One of the simplest things it does, and it's something that I can't believe, how old is CSS now? It's 15 years, almost 20 years, and we've never had a way to position something vertically centered in its parent element. So there's hacks, there's workarounds.
Does this work with a mix of percentage and flex? So if you want something 50% only, so flex the rest, can you do that?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You can mix units in there. So in my example, the lower example I've got here, I could have box B set at 20% and box A set at flex 1, and that would just fill all of the available space. So vertical centering, up until now we've had to hack our way around it, which seems absurd, is really, really easy. In Flexbox, you just tell it to align items to the center and justify content to the center, and that will just sit neatly, horizontally, and vertically centered inside its parent. And you can set different values to those, align items and justify content. Align items works along the horizontal axis, and justify content across the vertical. No, beg your pardon, it's the other way around. Justify content along the horizontal and align items on the vertical. So I could set those, instead of saying center, I could say end, align items end, and it would put that white box at the bottom of that box. Or I could say justify content start, and it would move it to the beginning of that box. So I can move that white box around inside its parent and put it wherever I like with just updating one value. Very, very exciting. This is like the example you just mentioned to me a second ago. So quite often when you have a form field, so you have an input box and you have a button, and you want them to fill the whole container, and that's just stupidly hard to do if you don't do it with percentages, if you want to mix values. And with Flexbox, extremely simple. You tell the parent to have a display value of flex. You say the input box should have a flex value of 1, and the button can have whatever units you want to put on it. And that's exactly the solution. We just said that input will just fill all the space available to it. It makes this stuff so easy. Flexbox is super exciting, and it's implemented in all modern browsers, including IE 10 and 11. So you'd have to provide some fallbacks for old IE if that's your cup of tea. But otherwise, depending on what you're doing, what you're building, you can use Flexbox today very, very easily. This is a really good site, solved by Flexbox. This guy just looks at some really common design problems. He's got there the vertical centering and the one I showed you, and layouts and media objects, and how super simple it is to do this stuff with Flexbox now. And layout is one of the big problems that new CSS is solving. Oh, by the way, we've stopped calling this CSS 3 now. There was a while we were saying it's CSS 3, but it's not really now. It's just CSS, because it's broken up into many different modules, and some of them move at different paces. We've got some modules are at level 1, while some modules are at level 4. So CSS 3 generally is kind of a word that just means new CSS. But we can kind of stop calling it CSS 3 from now on. But this idea of moving things around and resizing and making things just a bit more apt is also involved in intrinsic and extrinsic sizing, which is harder to say than it is to implement. Say you have a parent container with 2 children inside it, but 1 or 2 of them different lengths, but the parent's kind of fixed width, and you've got that big empty space. You don't want it to be that. You could just do display inline block, but that's not quite the effect we want to achieve. What we can do instead is just tell it to fit the content, and that box will just resize to be as wide as the maximum content inside it. Likewise, we can do the opposite and say be as wide as the smallest content inside there, and then it will actually resize that lower element until it's the same width as the one above it. And all of this stuff is implemented in browsers now. I just don't see many people using them, but it's all there. And it's really smart, and it can change the way you think about layouts. With Flexbox and this stuff, like layouts have become much, much more flexible than we've been used to in the past few years. I want to talk quickly now about the future. When I say the future, I just mean one possible future, not the future that's necessarily going to happen. And the stuff I'm going to talk about, some of it, I mean, it's all in the CSS modules. It's all being spec'd. It just may not all happen. Sometimes stuff gets spec'd and it doesn't happen. Browser vendors decide they don't want it. It's too hard to implement, something like that. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that this stuff will definitely happen. Most of it will, but I'm not going to tell you which ones will and which ones won't. And that's because predictions are for idiots. No one can predict with certainty the future. This is a quote, I love this one. There is no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. Mr. Steve Ballmer, 1997. Apropos of nothing, here's the current mobile OS browser share on one of my websites. That blue up there is iOS. And that little blue up there is Windows Phone. So how'd that prediction work out for you, Steve? So I was talking before about intrinsic sizes. I mentioned the fit content and min content. There's one more which is even cooler. And again, it kind of works around a common problem we have. And there's this problem of the clear fix. When we're doing floats, we have to do hacks, essentially, to make the layout work the way we want it to. We have to use, and we have to wrap it all in another float, or we have to use overflow hidden, or we have to add a clear fix class to do something like this. But it's much, much easier in new CSS. You just say, make this as wide or as high as the floats inside it. It's a natural clear float. clear fix in CSS. It's not implemented anywhere yet, but it's been proposed, it's been spec'd. Very well could come. Likewise, another common problem, we have selectors, this is a common pattern, a label and an input. And we can style the input based on the label because it follows it in the DOM, but we can't do anything to it the other way around. If we type into the input, nothing can happen to the label unless we use JavaScript, because there's no the connection doesn't work backwards through the DOM tree. So there's this. The thing in the middle, the for, it's a little complicated to explain, but basically what goes in there is the attribute whose value matches the ID of its matching pair. So in this case, the value of for is bar, which matches the ID of the input, which is bar. So whatever you put in there, that means create that connection. And it's kind of a backwards connection. So now if we do something to input, add a class to it, do whatever to it, then it styles the label. It's a backwards up the tree connection, which is new. And that's taken to an even more logical extreme by this, which looks like a kind of a common descendant selector, except you can see the exclamation point. This is known as the subject indicator. I prefer to call it the bang, just because it's fun to shout bang. The bang is essentially a parent selector. So in this thing here, we're styling the E based on the presence of the F, which you cannot do in CSS right now. You can do it in JavaScript. jQuery lets you do this stuff, lets you traverse up through the tree, but you can't do it in CSS. And the reason you can't do it in CSS is because it's very, very performance hungry. It will it has to go up many, many levels through the tree, and things can, if other changes are made, then it has to start recalculating. It's slow. It is a performance hog. For that reason, some of the new selectors are basically being split, and they're talking about the fast selectors and the complete selectors. The complete selectors include the stuff I've just shown you, but the fast selectors don't, because that stuff can be slow, can cause performance issues. The browsers will implement in CSS only the fast selectors. So you probably kind of think, well, what's the point then? What's the point in even speccing them if we're not going to be in CSS? And the reason is because you can do them in the complete profile, which can be done through JavaScript. So you won't be able to use that in your style sheets, but you will be able to use that in your CSS. So it's a natural parent selector in DOM queries in JavaScript, and in other things that access the DOM after the CSS. Basically, once the page is rendered and there's no more performance layout issues, then we can start using this stuff. A few more selectors for you, because I know you enjoyed the first bunch. At the moment, we can style a link based on the fact that it is a link that has not been visited, or a link that has been visited, or a link that is currently selected. So if I wanted something to kind of apply to all links, I'd have to use a few different selectors. But it'd be much easier instead to use the new any link. This selector just means, it's a pseudo class, apply these rules to any link regardless of their status. Or I can say just do them as local links, so ones which don't have any DNS lookup. It will kind of do a little regex passing on the link. It will say you can apply styles just to links that are only on the local domain and don't go external. More pseudo classes: active drop, invalid drop, valid drop. Drag and drop pseudo classes. When you're dragging and dropping stuff, now you can style up things without using JavaScript. Just makes it that little bit easier. These ones are cool as well. Current, past, and future. Those are for when you're writing CSS in your time machine. And they're based on, if you have something which has time, like a video player, for example, you can style things based on its current position, its current progress through the thing that has a time indicator. So you could, if you have a progress bar, for example, you could style all the stuff that came previously one color and all the stuff that came next a different color. Even more technical. Overflow. Ooh, shudder of excitement. Overflow at the moment, when you have, you set something to be overflow hidden, basically the rest of it becomes useless. But all you can do is either hide it or show it or scroll it. Those are the three states we have. Anything more than that, you have to do JavaScript trickery. Why can't we just paginate it? So we just paginate this, and the overflow would be put into blocks of equal height to the thing that it was, and there will be controls put on the screen, optional controls put on screen to allow you to paginate through the results in place. Essentially like a little carousel, natural carousel kind of thing, or paginated. You can do it to whole pages. You can turn your website into an ebook. Taking that to its logical extension, overflow it into fragments. So each fragment will again take on the characteristics of the main thing, and it'll just repeat it a number of times. See, if you have a box that's 200 pixels high and there's a bunch of overflow, it'll make another bunch of boxes 200 pixels high with the same rules applied. And that's useful because it's really, really easy to make a card-based interface, like on mobile. You can overflow stuff into separate cards. I know on mobile that's a really common pattern of just swiping through screens. You'll be able to do this with overflow naturally. And you'll also just be able to kind of style each one individually as well. Whoops. By using the fragment selector like that. So you'll be able to apply styles to each of them. So from just hiding or showing or scrolling stuff, we've gone to paginating it, we've gone to making card-based layouts with like 2 new properties. Brings me on to media queries. Media queries, they've kind of changed the way we work forever. And there's just this nagging feeling that they're not really fit for purpose. Because too many people are using them, or everyone really, we don't have a choice. We're making guesses about what the device is capable of based on the resolution of its screen. Judging the capabilities of a device by the resolution of its screen is like judging the height of a person by the color of their shoes. You've got no idea what that device does. Just because it's got a small screen doesn't really tell you anything. It could also have it could also be a tablet device with a 1280 by 800 screen, which would be exactly the same as a laptop with the same resolution, but the interface, the way they behave, is fundamentally completely different. But we're just judging stuff based on the dimensions of the viewport or the device screen. Doesn't make sense. Media queries are going to become a bit more useful. They're going to start going into kind of feature detection, which is, again, we do that right now with JavaScript, but we're going to do it better with new media queries. You'll be able to tell whether the site has script enabled or not. Very useful. You'll be able to tell whether the site has a hover state. You'll be able to tell whether how good the pointer, the interface is, whether it's fine, like a cursor, or coarse, like a finger, or whether it has none at all. You'll be able to tell the luminosity, how bright somewhere is. You'll be able to update pages based on how bright it is. Actually, you can kind of tone the colors down or push them up depending on the luminosity. And this idea of media queries becoming like feature testing is carried through further into conditionals with the supports at rule. And in supports, you put a property value pair that you want to test for. Like in this case, we would say, does this browser support the VH unit on height? If it does, we apply rules to it. If it doesn't, we don't. You'll recognize that if you've ever used Modernizer or something similar, and I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later. While we're talking about mobile, if you've done mobile development, you'll recognize that. Bit of a pain in the butt. It kind of does its job, but you've got to apply it to, it's kind of it's a blunt instrument. You put that in your page and every device has to obey it, and it doesn't matter. You can't kind of change it if the device changes orientation. You can't do much to it. It just always applies that rule all these rules to the page. So better to move it into CSS using the viewport rule, where we can just copy what we did here and say width is 100 VW, which is the rule we saw earlier. 100 VW is equivalent to device width. And set the zoom to 1, which is the same as initial scale. So we've got the same, the viewport meta tag is now in CSS, which means we can change it based on other media queries. We can start making pages that are more responsive to the actual device and the way the device is being used and what it's doing at that time. It's no longer that blunt instrument, it's much more delicate. So there's a few designers put their hands up, so I've got some good news for you guys. We've got all the boring techie stuff out the way. This is a typical designer I found. I don't know if they're the same here. Certainly that's what the London designers look like. Lots and lots of flashy new CSS stuff coming for designers. This is where it starts to get exciting. Grids. Everybody builds stuff on grids now, don't they? And everybody uses probably, I don't know, Blueprint or some kind of grid system, or maybe you use a SAS grid system or you know, something like that, which is all cool. We love these tools, but we want to do this stuff natively in CSS. And CSS has not got grids, and grids is something that's been around for so long. It seems such an obvious problem for CSS to solve. So they have. Take an element, you tell it to, just say it's going to be a grid. And in that grid, we set a bunch of columns. In this case, I got 3 columns of 1 FR, 1 FR, and 2 FR. And FR means fraction. It basically means divide up this space into a number of fractions. Again, it's just an easier, nicer way of using, instead of percentages, it's kind of doing the same job, but in a nicer and more consistent way, and doesn't have to worry about inheritance and the parent limitations. So that puts a couple of columns on the page. Now we want some rows, and we can use just normal values like this instead of the FR unit. We can say, okay, we'll make one row that's 10 EM height, one row that's automatic, so it'll change size depending on the content, and one that's 40 pixels. So we end up like this. So with 3 CSS properties, we've defined a grid layout. Very, very simple one in my example, but we've defined a grid layout. So what we then want to do is put stuff into that grid. So we take an element and we say put it in row 2, column 2, it sits in the grid. We can be a bit more flashy with it. We can say, okay, put this one in column 1, 3, these 2 values, where it starts and where it ends. So put it in column 1 and end in column 3. It does that. Or we can use this grid area, which takes 4 values, and the values are column start, column end, row end. So in this case, it's going to start in column 2, row 2, and end in column 3, row 3. So we'll have something like that. Very, very few lines of CSS, grid-based layout, no JavaScript involved, no extra markup involved. It's fully responsive. You can change that completely or remove it entirely depending on the media queries that you use. It's exciting. And the first browser to implement it was Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer 10 has this. Safari, I think the new Safari has this. Safari 7. It's coming in Chrome. It's being worked on in Firefox. It's coming. It's happening soon. Really, really easy.
Didn't they introduce it for a Windows Store app?
Sorry?
Didn't they introduce it because of the Windows Store app?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, in the new Windows 8, you can build apps using HTML and CSS. And in order to not have to use...
XAML, they needed something that would translate equally well to HTML and JavaScript.
Right.
So
Yeah, so it's based on work that Microsoft did a few years ago. It's gone into the W3C, but essentially, yeah, they wanted to be able to make their apps work in HTML and CSS and not have to do all this stuff with floats like we do now, because if you had to build web apps using floats and clears and position absolute, you'd blow your brains out probably. You can even name this stuff. This is even easier. Each string is a row, and each item in the string, each space-separated item is a column. So in this we're saying, first row we want 3 columns, and we're going to call them head. Second row we want 3 columns. We're going to call the one on the left nav and the 2 in the middle main. And the 3 at the bottom we're going to call foot. And you end up with a grid that looks like this. This is a little bit simpler. I've simplified it a little bit because you can add in dimensions as we did previously, but at its essence that would put out a 3 by 3 grid that looks something like that. And then you can just say, okay, put this element in the head. Whoops. How did I do that? So that would put them in the head. Or you could say put this one in the main, and that would just cover the main like that. So incredibly simple grid. You can't do super sophisticated grids like this, but if you want to do a quick grid and just throw something together quickly, it doesn't get much simpler than that. Fonts, font kerning. Designers love font kerning. They talk to me for hours about font kerning. You can do font kerning in CSS now. You can just set it to normal or off, essentially. You let the browser decide. You can also start using font variants, so small caps and ligatures and all that stuff. You can control using a few CSS properties. You can set icons. Instead of doing icon replacement as we do at the moment using kind of SVG URLs or whatever, you can actually set an icon. You could set it to be an icon and just put the icon in there. So we can replace those in a nice, meaningful, semantic way. You can chop up background images. You can, when you set an image, there's the new image function, by the way, instead of URL, there's a proposed image function because it's extended, it does more stuff. And you can say, of this URL, use only this part. And that's X, Y, WH is the top left coordinates, and the WH is the width and height. So say, of this image, only use this bit. So say we had an image of ace of base, for example. But we only wanted the guy in the top left, Joker. We only wanted to use his face on our website. We could just set a few things, and it would just use that part of the image. It's essentially natural image spriting. If you use image spriting right now, it's just been formalized. It's been made easy. You can do image fallbacks. So you can say, in order of preference, use foo.svg. If that's not available, if the browser doesn't support SVG, use foo.png. If that's not available, just be red. Going even further, we can use the image set function, and you can actually start using resolution in this. So this is for kind of not 100% responsive, but images based on device resolution or device pixel ratio. So you can say, for a regular device, use this foo.png. For one which has a retina screen, use a high resolution. And for print, use this super high resolution one. This one took a little bit of working out at first. I didn't quite get this. Sure.
So, say if I have an avatar, for example, and I set that using JavaScript, can I have fallbacks, like if the primary one doesn't work, for example, if the user uploaded a PNG file and I didn't convert it properly, or something like that?
So could you use image set if it was set with JavaScript? Yeah, I don't see why not. You could do it through the CSS, through the style object, just add it in through there. I think it's actually implemented in Safari 6, so give it a try. I think it should work. So yeah, this one I didn't quite get at first when I heard this, but basically say we've got element A and element B, and then what we can do with this property here, this element property, is we can use element B, in this case, as a background image for element A. So exactly how it's rendered with all the markup and everything, it kind of takes an image, almost like a little screen grab just of that bit, and sets it as a background image for A. So you kind of end up with something like that. And I couldn't quite see the use case for this at first. But then someone pointed out to me that you could, for example, have a carousel or an image gallery which does a little preview of what's coming next. And rather than having to load in a separate image, you could have what's coming next just not hidden in a separate layer, and just display a little preview of it, a little thumbnail preview. So it's like for thumbnailing, which is a really good idea. Gradients, at the moment we have radial and linear gradients. We can soon have conic gradients. So again, if you're a designer and you want to do some nice shiny little fake knobs, you can use conic gradients for that. And image crossfading. Take 2 images and just set the percentage of which one, of blended between the two of them in AR. So say you have a picture, for example, ABBA dressed in tinfoil, and you thought, I really want to spice this up with a bit of Amon Amrath. You could just blend the two together like that, and you get this nice little composite image of like ABBA dressed in tinfoil being attacked by a phantom axeman. Clients have requested weirder things.
Could this be advanced together with the spriting? So you could mix up the four pictures of the face people and
I like the way you think. Could you take the 4 pictures of Ace of Base and sprite them and do that with it? Yes. Yeah, I think you could. You could use the XYWH on the same image and do that. Yeah, absolutely. That would make for some kind of terrifying nightmare image, wouldn't it? Colors. At the moment, RGB, HSL. This is a new one, HWB. Apparently, really the most easy way to think about color. This is kind of a fairly new algorithm that was only done in the mid-90s or something. Basically, you set a hue, which is the first value, so 180 degrees, and then you set the percentage of white and the percentage of black, and it will just kind of tweak the image based on your input. And then the value at the end is the opacity. I haven't used this, it's not implemented anywhere, but apparently it's just really easy to tweak it to find the exact color value you're looking for. Or you can just use grays. You can use gray scales from now on. Just say 75% gray and set an opacity on it, which is, again, another thing that you quite often have to do is get asked to, set this to like 20% gray or something. And you go, I don't know what 20% gray is in RGB. But this is going to make it very easy. CMYK, if you do any printing stuff, you'll be happy to hear about this. Finally, CMYK, nobody really prints stuff anymore, but now that they've finally introduced it, now that printers are being scrapped and taken away. 4 values, each one between 0 and 1, and then one at the end, an extra one for opacity, again, for alpha channel again. And this one, again, took a little bit of working out at first. The new color property. What this can do is this allows you to do little tweaks to colors. So in this case, I've got the color blue, which is the value that the browser knows, and the little function after it means increase saturation by 10%. So you can set saturation, lightness, you can do all that just with little functions. So you can take a color and just really naturally tweak it. It's something that's come out of people using SAS and LESS and stuff like that because they provide a lot of color functions, and I think they've been so useful that they've decided to adopt this natively. And I'm gonna come back and talk about that again. One of the more surprising things about the new hot fancy web stuff has been the rise of Adobe. And Adobe are doing some heavily involved with the development of CSS. Adobe have written 4 or 5 specs, CSS specs, which you may not have expected. They're betting everything on the web platform now. They know that Flash's days are numbered. They're kind of changing focus completely. What's good about that is obviously Adobe have got years of experience of making shitty overpriced software. But they also have years of experience of, Photoshop and image editing and all this stuff. So they know a thing or two about image algorithms and so on. So what they're bringing is a lot of the experience of their other apps natively into CSS. If we have time at the end of my talk, 5 minutes or so, I'll show you a few demos of these because they're quite impressive. First and easiest one is just filters. You can just blur stuff. You can grayscale, you can set sepia. You can do all this right now in SVG, depending on what browser you're using. This just kind of makes it easier. It's just setting keyword shorthands for some of the stuff you can do in SVG already. But what you can do with it beyond simple preset filters is you can do custom filters. And this is where it gets really crazy. Custom filters allow you to set up kind of maps in WebGL and then apply them to HTML elements. So you can take things like a pretty standard layout and sort of ripple and bump it using 3D mapping, all in CSS. Obviously, you have to set it up in WebGL first, but if other people do the hard work for you, you just apply it with CSS. If you use Photoshop, you'll obviously be familiar with blend modes. There's 2 types of blend. Blend modes just essentially change. I don't understand it personally. I just take the things and say, we can't do that. But blend modes essentially kind of change the way that colors or layers interact with each other. If you use Photoshop, every designer in Photoshop loves to put loads of blend modes on everything. You can do this mix blend mode, which would be the element blended with its own background. And again, it'll be easy when I show you a demo if we have a little bit of time. Or you can do the background blend mode, which is the background of the element with the element that's below it as it's laid out. Hopefully I'll get a chance to explain those to you. But if you use Photoshop and you love your blend modes, they're coming to CSS. You can use image masks as well. So take element here, you set an image mask in it, and the area that's solid or filled in the image that's not transparent will be used to mask it. So you can kind of just change it to get nice custom background shapes, which you couldn't have before without creating extra images. You change the colors and so on. You can clip elements. So again, take this element, we just say we want to clip it to only show a circle. So we have this, it's now become a circle. And only the stuff inside the circle will be displayed, everything around the outside of it will be hidden. So all of a sudden, again, you can start seeing how this is going to open up new layouts, new layout opportunities, of not having everything having to be so square.
Yeah, that's probably what you get. But was it hidden or removed?
It's hidden. But I'm going to show you something in a sec which will go a little bit beyond that. Yeah, so the stuff around the outside, that box would still be there. It would just be not displayed. It would be transparent, totally transparent, but it would still occupy the space in the DOM. One of the really cool things that Adobe's working on that I'm really excited about is this thing called regions. And regions allows you to split up text and put it into layouts which we just can't do at the moment. Not easily anyway, not without a lot of JavaScript trickery. Say we have element A and it's full of text content, and we say, okay, we want to flow the content of A into this thing called foo. Doesn't matter what foo is, a cloud, a monkey, it doesn't matter. It's just something called foo. All of that is now held in this foo, which is that. And then we can take the content of foo and we can flow the content back out of it into other elements. So we've taken the content of A then disappears, it becomes invisible, and we take that content, we put it into B. And I know, when I heard that, I was like, so what's the point in that? The point in that is you can do it across multiple elements. So you'd flow content from foo into B, and then any overflow from B could go into C, and then the overflow from C could go into D. So you could put these wherever you wanted on your page, and the content would just flow naturally through them. It wouldn't have to be one single unbroken column of text anymore. You can start making really rich magazine-style layouts where and they'll be resizable and responsive, and this stuff will just flow into it really nicely. And again, I will show you, if I've got time, a very, very quick example of that. But I'm aware that I'm rambling on, so I'm going to rush through the rest of this. Exclusions. If you have some text content and you just position an element over the top of it like that, nothing happens. The positioned element does not interact with what's underneath it, except if we set it to be an exclusion, we say this will be a wrap flow. It basically treats it like a float, so it affects what's underneath it. All the content that's underneath it will now flow around it on either side. So we can start dropping images into the middle of our text instead of floating it to the right and left as we do at the moment. Doesn't even need to be a square. You can set it to be a circle, and the content will flow around naturally around the outside, which is where we came in before and talked about the masking before. You could set one of these and work around the mask, so you actually have like little rounded images and the content flows around it naturally. Or you can do the opposite and flow the content inside a shape. So we now start getting custom boxes where the content will flow inside it, and we start making shapes. And it doesn't have to be all boxy anymore. It doesn't have to be all squares all the time. You can do circles, or you can draw your own polygon shapes. So the last bit I wanted to talk about is about you as developers, and how you are changing the future of CSS. And I showed you earlier the supports thing, and I mentioned, well, that's kind of quite similar to how Modernizer does stuff. It's feature detection, and that's intentional. A lot of what the CSS working group are doing now is looking at the stuff developers use, looking at the tools that are insanely popular, and saying, let's make them standards, let's make them native. If you ask the people on Modernizer, they will say the point of Modernizer is to become obsolete. They don't want to keep using it forever. It's there because they want to show that this thing needs to be done. So it's being done. It's a similar thing with query selector, which came directly from jQuery, the string selector in jQuery. And it's the same with the new element. That's actually wrong. That should be template. My apologies for that. That should be the template element, which is a way of making like handlebars or mustache use a wrapper around markup, and the template element is going to do that natively in HTML. So they're looking at stuff that people are doing, and they're making them standards. So we've got things like custom properties. Custom properties are CSS variables, essentially. You can set a custom property. It has to be prefixed with var hyphen. So here I've set it on the root because it's going to be global. And I've said, given it a made-up name, brand, and I've given it a value. So then down in my text, I can call that value in like that. So those are essentially variables. They're limited variables. You can't use them everywhere. You can only use them in values for now. But they're based on the fact that SAS and less are so insanely popular. People obviously want variables. So let's see what variables can do in CSS. You can set it to global scope, or you can just set it to local scope as well. You can start scoping all of these variables. And this comes in really handy in the future when we start using more modular, reusable web widgets. I don't know if you've heard of web components, but there's this idea of breaking up into little chunks and dropping it everywhere. We can start actually scoping our style sheets and saying these rules only apply to this widget here instead of to the whole document. Also, just as popular as variables, obviously, are mix-ins. Mix-ins are being discussed, but they're not imminent, not right yet. But they are being talked about because that's a major feature. Likewise, nesting. Nesting, another super popular feature of SAS and less. So here, so much repetition here, foo h1, foo h1 em, foo ul. You could just do that much, much easier by using the ampersand selected to mean the thing before me. You can start nesting your rules. This is known as hierarchy in CSS. Being discussed, not implemented yet, but they know people want it, they are making it. So, I asked at the beginning, like, when can we use them? That's the question. I've said throughout, some of them are really stable. The ones at the beginning are really stable. You can start using them right now. There's a couple of things just to bear in mind before I give the answer. The first is that browser update cycles are getting more frequent. Chrome is now 8 weeks between releases, I think. Mozilla is 6 weeks between releases. Even Internet Explorer now is on a yearly cycle. A yearly cycle compared to the 7 years, or what was it, between IE6 and IE7 is huge progress. But as they become more mobile, as they become like multi-device, they're going to have to speed that development up as well, I think. The other thing to remember is that old Internet Explorer is dying fast. It's dying very, very quickly. By old, I mean 9 and below. 6 is basically gone. Does anybody here still have to code for 6? Sometimes, yeah. So occasionally you get a client who's on, you know, I should have known it was you by the fact that you've been crying all afternoon. So old IE is dying fast. This is not global stats, but this is from aggregated across a few sites I manage with high traffic. This pale blue at the bottom, that's all versions of IE. So in the last 3 years, IE has gone from almost 50%, that's every version combined, down to 25%, so it's halved. It's almost halved the use of IE in that time. And at the same time, this chart shows the different versions of IE. The one to watch is IE9, and this is only over the first 6 months of this year. IE9 in January had 43% share, and in 6 months, that's gone down to 27.8%. And you see the yellow one at the top, the strong yellow, that's IE10. That's gone from 2.3% to 28.6%. So huge increase in IE10 uptake, massive decrease in IE9. IE8 is also falling slightly slower because we've still got the problem with Windows XP. But all of these figures at the same time as IE's overall market share is declining, means that actual use of IE is going down, old versions of IE is going down very, very quickly. So you may not have to wait too long for some of this stuff. But the two main things you need to consider are First of all, your environment. If you're developing web apps, mobile apps like using PhoneGap or WebView or whatever, you can use a lot of this stuff right now because a lot of it's in mobile Safari. You don't have to worry about other browsers. So if that's what you're developing for and you don't have to worry about cross-browser development, you're cool. Same with, we built an app for Spotify recently, and Spotify just use Chromium. The whole thing's based on Chromium. So we built a web app. We didn't have to worry about any cross-browser support. We could use a ton of this stuff. So depending on your environment, you can use this stuff straight away. The other question is kind of how much do you want to use it? If you really, really want to use this stuff and you just want to practice with it, and it's kind of almost at the tipping point of browser implementation, you can do it. Just make sure that you just kind of provide, it means extra work. You have to give safe fallback for older browsers. You have to kind of look into browser support, a bit more testing time. If you really, really want to use this stuff, most of it you can, but you will have to invest the extra time in it. I will have to say at the end of that tack, and this is my book, The Modern Web, which talks about CSS3, as it were, and HTML5 and other kind of modern stuff. Is available in all good retailers, blah, blah, blah. Me being stupid, didn't bring any copies to give away with me. Sorry? Was that a heckle? No. When I said me being stupid, someone went, yes. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. I didn't get time to show any demos, but I'm going to be around sort of outside for a little bit if anybody wants to come and look over my shoulder. Otherwise, I'm going to stick all the links for all the demos I was going to show in the slides when I put them online later. And we don't have any times for questions, unfortunately, but we want to make some quick announcements about the tech raffle and so on, so don't go up and go to the toilet just yet.